A lonely cowboy thought his dog was gone, but it returned leading him to an injured black widow, clutching a blood-stained ledger in an abandoned mine shaft. The broken-down rancher stumbles through town like a ghost, merchants turning their backs as he begs for medical supplies. Crazy hermit lost everything, they whisper, probably talking to shadows now. His fate seems sealed, die alone in that rotting cabin, forgotten by civilization. But the trembling widow he's protecting carries secrets that could destroy the very men who stole his land. Her husband died uncovering a conspiracy that reaches the town's most trusted leaders. Together, they possess evidence of systematic theft affecting dozens of families. Yet armed men hunt her relentlessly, and the corrupt sheriff closes in on their hideout. Will exposing the truth save their community, or will they both disappear like so many others who dared to resist? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The sun cracked the horizon as Ezra Holloway cupped his hands around his mouth and called into the empty prairie. His voice echoed back, hollow and desperate. 3 days without Rusty. 3 days of searching every gulch and canyon near his ramshackle cabin. The cattle dog had never wandered this long. Something was wrong. Ezra's boots crunched through dried grass as he made his way toward town. His water ran out yesterday. His supplies were nearly gone. The general store would have what he needed, but facing those stairs again made his stomach clench. The bell above Murphy's general store clanged as Ezra pushed inside. Conversation stopped. Eyes turned away. Mrs. Murphy's smile vanished when she saw him approaching the counter. "Need some medical supplies," Ezra said quietly. "What kind of medical supplies?" Her tone carried suspicion. "Bandages, antiseptic, whatever you got for cleaning wounds." 2 men near the flour barrels exchanged glances. One leaned toward the other and whispered something that made them both snicker. Ezra caught the word crazy and hermit before they turned back to their conversation. Mrs. Murphy gathered the supplies with obvious reluctance. "That'll be $4. Ezra counted out his remaining coins, the exact amount, his last money until he could trap enough pelts to trade. "Heard you been wandering around talking to yourself," one of the men called out. "Finally lost your mind completely?" Ezra ignored him and took his supplies. The bell clanged again as he left. Outside, he nearly collided with Sheriff Morrison climbing the store steps. The lawman's hand rested on his gun belt. His eyes were cold and calculating. "Ezra Holloway, haven't seen you in town for months." "Just getting supplies." Morrison glanced at the bag in Ezra's hands. "Medical supplies. You hurt?" "My dog's been missing. Want to be prepared when I find him." The sheriff's expression didn't change. "Been getting reports of suspicious activity out your way. Strangers moving around at night. You seen anything unusual?" Ezra's throat tightened. "No strangers. Just me and empty land." Morrison stepped closer. His voice dropped low. "If you're harboring fugitives, that makes you an accomplice. Federal crime. You understand what that means?" "I understand I got a missing dog to find." The sheriff watched him walk away. Ezra felt those eyes boring into his back until he rounded the corner. The walk home took 2 hours. Ezra's mind raced with Morrison's words. Fugitives. Suspicious activity. What did the sheriff know that he didn't? As he crested the hill above his cabin, movement caught his eye. A dark shape limping across the meadow. Rusty. The dog's left front paw was wrapped in torn fabric. His coat was matted with burrs and mud, but his tail wagged when he saw Ezra running toward him. "Where you been, boy?" Ezra knelt and examined the injured paw. The fabric looked like it came from a dress or apron. Someone had bandaged the dog's wound. Rusty whined and looked back toward the old mining area. He took a few steps in that direction, then stopped and looked at Ezra expectantly. "You want me to follow you?" The dog barked once and limped forward. The abandoned copper mine sat in a cluster of weathered hills a mile from Ezra's cabin. Nobody had worked those shafts for 10 years. The wooden support beams were rotting. Most of the tunnels had collapsed. Rusty led him to the largest opening. The entrance was partially hidden by fallen rocks and scrub brush. The dog squeezed through a gap and disappeared into the darkness. Ezra pulled aside the brush and crawled after him. The tunnel stretched back into the hillside. Faint light filtered down from a crack in the ceiling. His eyes adjusted to the gloom. In the back corner, a woman sat huddled against the rock wall. Her dress was torn and stained with dirt and blood. Her dark skin was marked with scratches and bruises. A leather satchel was clutched against her chest like a shield. She looked up when she heard him approaching. Fear flashed in her eyes. She tried to scramble backward but winced in pain. "Easy," Ezra said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you." Rusty limped over to the woman and sat beside her. She placed a trembling hand on the dog's head, the same hand that had bandaged his injured paw. "You helped my dog," Ezra said. The woman nodded but didn't speak. Her eyes darted between Ezra and the tunnel entrance. "You're hurt bad. Need proper doctoring." "Can't," she whispered. "They'll find me." "Who's looking for you?" She clutched the satchel tighter. "Men with guns. They killed my husband. Burned our farm." Ezra studied her face, the exhaustion, the terror, the way she protected that leather bag like it contained something precious. "How long you been hiding here?" 5 days, maybe 6. Hard to tell in the dark. 5 days without proper food or water. 5 days sleeping on cold stone. It was a miracle she was still alive. "Can you walk?" "Don't know." Ezra moved closer slowly, keeping his hands visible. "My cabin's not far. Got food and clean water. Place where you can rest proper." The woman's grip tightened on the satchel. "Why would you help me?" Ezra looked at Rusty, then back at her. "Because you helped my dog when he needed it." She stared at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. Ezra half-carried Grace Washington across the meadow to his cabin. Every few steps she stumbled, but she refused to let go of that leather satchel. Her breathing came in short gasps by the time they reached his porch. The cabin was small and rough, but clean. Ezra had built the furniture himself from scrapped lumber. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. Shelves lined with books and surveying equipment filled another. Grace collapsed onto the wooden chair by his table. Her eyes swept the room, cataloging every detail. The surveying tools caught her attention. "You're a surveyor," she said. "Was, before I lost everything." Ezra filled a basin with water from his rain barrel. He tore strips from an old shirt for bandages. His movements were gentle and practiced. "Had to nurse my wife through a long sickness," he explained, seeing Grace's surprised expression. "Learned how to tend wounds proper." Grace allowed him to clean the cuts on her arms and face. The antiseptic stung, but she didn't flinch. When he finished, she clutched the satchel again. "What's in the bag?" Ezra asked. Grace hesitated. Then she opened the leather flap and pulled out a thick ledger bound in black cloth. The pages were covered with neat handwriting and official stamps. "My husband worked as a clerk before we got our farm. He kept detailed records of every land transaction in the county." Grace's voice was barely above a whisper. "He discovered something terrible." She opened the ledger to a page marked with a red ribbon. Columns of names, dates, and property descriptions filled the paper. Some entries were crossed out in red ink. "These are all the farms that got foreclosed in the past 2 years," Grace said. "Look at the dates." Ezra studied the entries. His surveyor training made him quick with numbers and patterns. Something was wrong with the timeline. Foreclosure notices dated before mortgage payments were actually late. Property valuations that changed overnight. "This is my place," Ezra said, pointing to an entry near the bottom. The foreclosure date was listed as 3 weeks before he'd actually missed his payment. "Every family on this list lost their land the same way. Sudden changes in loan terms, impossible payment schedules, property boundaries that shifted without explanation." Grace turned to another page. This one showed a map of the county with colored sections. Red areas marked foreclosed properties. Blue sections showed who bought the land afterward. "Look at the buyers," Grace said. The same 3 names appeared, over and over. Morrison Land Company, Whitmore Holdings, Territorial Development Group. Ezra's blood turned cold. Morrison. The sheriff's name was Morrison. Sheriff Morrison owns a land company? Not just owns it. He uses his badge to intimidate families into signing papers they don't understand. My husband documented everything. The sound of horses approaching made them both freeze. Ezra moved to the window and peered through the gap in the curtains. 3 riders in dusty coats were dismounting outside. Sheriff Morrison led them. "Hide," Ezra whispered. Grace grabbed the ledger and slipped behind the woodpile near the fireplace. Ezra shoved the medical supplies under his bed and opened the door before Morrison could knock. "Sheriff, what brings you out this way?" Morrison pushed past him into the cabin. His deputies flanked the doorway. Their hands rested on their gun belts. "Routine check, making sure you're not harboring any fugitives." Morrison's eyes swept the room. He noticed the basin of bloody water on the table, the torn shirt strips scattered nearby. "You been hurt, Ezra?" "Cut myself chopping wood, clumsy with an axe." Morrison picked up one of the bandage strips. It was stained with blood, but not the right color for a fresh wound. This blood was darker, older. "Funny thing about harboring fugitives," Morrison said casually. "Makes a man an accessory to murder. Federal crime. Could get you hanged." "I don't know nothing about any murder." "Course you don't." Morrison dropped the bloody cloth. "But if you did know something, you'd tell me, right? Being a law-abiding citizen and all." Ezra nodded. His mouth had gone dry. Morrison walked slowly around the cabin. He examined the surveying equipment on the shelves, maps and measuring tools that Ezra hadn't touched in 2 years. "You know, I always wondered how a smart man like you ended up losing his land. Surveyor ought to understand property law better than most folks." "Bad luck. Market turned." "Maybe. Or maybe you just trusted the wrong people." Morrison stopped in front of the fireplace. Grace was hidden just feet away behind the woodpile. If he looked around the stone hearth, he'd see her. "You still got all your old survey maps?" Morrison asked. "Some of them." "Mind if I take a look? Official business?" Morrison reached for the shelf above the fireplace. His hand passed inches from where Grace was crouched. Ezra's heart hammered against his ribs. A crash from outside made everyone jump. One of the horses had spooked and knocked over Ezra's water barrel. The deputy outside was struggling to control the animal. Morrison cursed and headed for the door. "Get that horse settled before it kicks someone." While Morrison dealt with the commotion, Ezra caught Grace's eye and pointed toward his bedroom. She crept across the floor on her hands and knees, staying below the window level. Morrison returned a few minutes later. His deputies had remounted there. "Horses. We'll be patrolling this area regular now," Morrison said. "Lot of dangerous folks moving through. You see anything suspicious? You send word immediately." "I will." Morrison mounted his horse and rode away with his men. Ezra watched until they disappeared over the ridge before calling Grace out of hiding. She emerged from the bedroom with the ledger pressed against her chest. Her hands were shaking. "He would have killed us both," she said. "Maybe, but he didn't find you." Grace opened the ledger again and turned to a page near the back. Fresh entries in her husband's careful handwriting documented the systematic theft of land across the entire county. "There's more," she said quietly. "The land company names are fake. They're all controlled by the same person." She pointed to a notation at the bottom of the page, a single name written in red ink. Judge Augustus Whitmore. Grace's infected wound turned angry red by the 3rd day. Fever burned through her body. She shivered despite the warm blanket Ezra wrapped around her shoulders. "Need proper medicine," Ezra said, checking the swollen cut on her arm. "What I got here ain't enough. Too dangerous. Morrison's watching. You'll die if this gets worse." Grace knew he was right. The infection was spreading. Red lines traced up her arm toward her shoulder. She needed a real doctor. Ezra made the decision for both of them. He hitched his old mare to the wagon and helped Grace into the back. The ledger stayed hidden under loose floorboards in his cabin. Doc Eleanor Hayes ran the only medical practice within 50 miles. Her office sat above the barbershop on Main Street. People whispered about a woman doctor, but nobody argued when they needed healing. Ezra carried Grace up the narrow stairs. Doc Hayes opened the door before he could knock. She was a stern woman with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Infected wound," Ezra said. Doc Hayes helped him get Grace onto the examination table. She rolled up Grace's sleeve and studied the red streaks. Her expression grew serious. Blood poisoning. Another day and she'd be dead. Doc Hayes worked quickly. She cleaned the wound with carbolic acid and applied fresh bandages. Grace gritted her teeth but didn't cry out. "How'd this happen?" Doc Hayes asked. "Accident," Grace said weakly. Doc Hayes looked from Grace to Ezra. "Funny kind of accident. Looks like rope burns around her wrists, bruises on her face. Someone was hunting this woman." Ezra and Grace exchanged glances. Doc Hayes caught the look. "I've treated 3 other women in the past 6 months with similar injuries. All of them claimed accidents. All of them were terrified to tell the truth." Grace struggled to sit up. "What happened to them?" "2 moved away, sudden-like. One died when her husband fell off his horse. Broke his neck." Doc Hayes' voice carried bitter suspicion. "Lot of accidents happening to folks who ask too many questions." Ezra made a decision. "Show her." Grace hesitated, then nodded. "We need help. Can't do this alone." While Doc Hayes finished bandaging Grace's arm, Ezra explained about the ledger, the forged documents, the systematic land theft, Judge Whitmore's involvement. "Makes sense," Doc Hayes said when he finished. "I've been wondering why so many farming families suddenly packed up and left. Now I know they didn't leave voluntarily." She opened a cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. Medical records filled with careful notes and sketches. Been documenting suspicious injuries for months. Broken bones that don't match the stories people tell. Women beaten, but claiming they fell downstairs. Men with bullet wounds who insist they were cleaning their guns. Grace examined the medical drawings. Each one showed the same pattern. People hurt badly enough to send a message, but not badly enough to die immediately. "Intimidation," Grace said. "Scare families into selling cheap or just abandoning their claims." "Your husband wasn't the only one who figured it out," Doc Hayes said. "Others started asking questions too. That's when the accidents began." Doc Hayes locked her office door and pulled the curtains closed. She lit an oil lamp and set it on the table between them. "If what you're saying is true, Whitmore and Morrison control half the county by now. They're not going to stop just because we know about it." "What do you suggest?" Ezra asked. "We need proof that will stand up in federal court. Local law can't be trusted." Grace thought about the ledger hidden under Ezra's floorboards. "We have documentation, names, dates, forged signatures. That's a start. But we need witnesses, people willing to testify about what really happened to their families." Doc Hayes spread her medical records on the table. Each file told the same story. Families pressured to sell. Mysterious accidents when they refused. Properties seized for unpaid taxes that had actually been paid. "I can provide medical evidence of systematic intimidation, but we need the victims to speak up." "They're scared," Grace said. "Morrison's got them believing he'll kill anyone who talks." "Maybe he will. That's why we need to move fast." Ezra studied the medical records. His surveyor mind began connecting patterns. Property locations, timeline of incidents, geographic spread of the corruption. "There's a town meeting next week," he said. "Monthly gathering where people air grievances and vote on community business." "Whitmore runs those meetings," Doc Hayes said. "Exactly. If we present evidence in front of the whole community, he'll have to respond. Can't make us all disappear without raising suspicions." Grace shook her head. "Too dangerous. Morrison will arrest us before we can say a word. Not if we're smart about it. Get people talking first. Plant seeds of doubt, then hit them with the proof when they're ready to listen." Doc Hayes gathered the medical files. "I'll talk to some of my patients. Quietly. Feel them out about testifying." "I'll go back and study that ledger," Grace said. "Find the strongest evidence. Documents that can't be explained away." "What about Morrison?" Ezra asked. "He's going to keep looking for you." "Let him look. We've got 6 days to build our case." Doc Hayes handed Grace a bottle of medicine. "Take this twice daily for the infection, and stay hidden until the meeting. If Morrison finds you before then, all this planning won't matter." They left the doctor's office separately. Grace rode in the back of Ezra's wagon, covered by blankets and grain sacks. Nobody paid attention to a lonely farmer heading home after a supply run. Back at the cabin, they spread the ledger pages across Ezra's table. The evidence was overwhelming. Dozens of forged documents, property surveys that changed overnight, tax assessments that tripled without explanation. This should be enough, Grace said. For honest people, maybe. But Whitmore's got most of the town convinced he's protecting them from outside threats. Grace traced a finger down a column of foreclosed properties. What if we're not the only ones who figured this out? What if other families kept records too? Ezra looked up from the documents. Worth checking. Some of these folks might still be in the area, or they might be too scared to help. Only one way to find out. Grace closed the ledger and looked out the window. The sun was setting behind the hills. 6 days to convince a frightened community to stand up against the most powerful men in the county. 6 days to expose the truth before Morrison found them. The next morning brought thundering hoofbeats and barking dogs. Morrison had returned with 6 deputies and a pack of tracking hounds. They surrounded Ezra's cabin before dawn. "Ezra Holloway, come out with your hands visible." Grace grabbed the ledger and slipped out the back window while Ezra stalled at the front door. She crawled under the porch and pressed herself against the wooden support beams. "What's this about, Sheriff?" "Federal marshals want to question you about harboring fugitives. Step outside nice and slow." Morrison pushed past Ezra into the cabin. His deputies spread out, checking every corner. One man poked through the bedding with his rifle barrel. Another overturned the table and chairs. "Where is she, Ezra?" "Where's who?" Morrison backhanded him across the face. "The murderer you've been hiding, Grace Washington, killed a federal tax collector down south." Grace's blood turned to ice. They were calling her a murderer, making her the criminal instead of the victim. "Don't know anyone by that name." Morrison nodded to his deputies. They tore through the cabin like wild animals, books scattered across the floor, surveying equipment smashed against the walls. They ripped up floorboards looking for hiding spots. One deputy found the loose boards where the ledger had been hidden. "Something was stored here, Sheriff. Recent." Morrison examined the hiding spot. Dust patterns showed where a large book had rested. Fresh scratches marked where someone had pried up the boards in a hurry. "You're harboring evidence of federal crimes. That makes you an accessory." "Evidence of what?" "Tax evasion, fraud, murder." Morrison grabbed Ezra by the shirt. "Where's the woman, and where are the stolen documents?" "I told you I don't know about any woman." Morrison's fist caught Ezra in the stomach. He doubled over, gasping for air. The deputies laughed. "Tear this place apart," Morrison ordered. "Check the barn, the well, every hiding spot within a mile." Grace pressed deeper into the shadows under the porch. The ledger was clutched against her chest. If they found her now, everything would be lost. The search took 3 hours. Deputies dragged furniture outside and chopped it apart with axes. They dumped Ezra's grain stores and scattered his tools. They shot Rusty when the dog tried to protect his master's belongings. Grace bit her knuckle to keep from crying out as Rusty's body hit the ground. The loyal dog who had led Ezra to her was dead because of her presence. "Nothing here, Sheriff," one deputy reported. Morrison stood in the ruins of Ezra's cabin. His face was red with frustration. "She was here. I can smell her. Maybe she moved on. Maybe." Morrison grabbed Ezra by the throat. "But you're coming with us until we find her." They bound Ezra's hands and threw him across a horse. The group rode toward town with their prisoner. Grace waited until the hoofbeats faded before crawling out from under the porch. The cabin was destroyed. Everything Ezra owned lay scattered and broken in the dirt. Rusty's blood stained the wooden steps. Grace knelt beside the dog's body and whispered an apology. She couldn't stay here. Morrison would return with more men. But she couldn't abandon Ezra either. He was in jail because of her. Grace wrapped the ledger in oilcloth and buried it under a pile of rocks near the well. Then she set out cross-country toward town. She had to reach Doc Hayes. The doctor's office was closed, but Grace climbed the back stairs and tapped on the window. Doc Hayes let her in quickly and bolted the door. "Morrison arrested Ezra," Grace said. "Destroyed his cabin. They're calling me a murderer. I heard the commotion from here. Half the town saw them bring Ezra in chains. Doc Hayes led Grace to a small back room filled with medical supplies. You can't stay here long. Morrison will search every building. What about the town meeting? It's tomorrow night. Canceled. Morrison convinced the mayor that dangerous criminals were planning to disrupt it. Grace sank into a chair. Their plan was falling apart. Ezra was in jail. The meeting was canceled. Morrison controlled the entire town. We have to do something. Ezra will hang if I don't clear his name. Doc Hayes paced the small room. Morrison's moving too. Fast. He knows we're close to exposing him. Then we expose him tonight, before he can silence us permanently. How? He's got Ezra locked up. The townspeople are too scared to listen. Grace thought about the families mentioned in the ledger. Dozens of people who had lost everything to Whitmore's schemes. Some were still in the area, working as farmhands or living in shacks outside town. The people who lost their farms, they're not gone, they're just invisible. Doc Hayes stopped pacing. You want to organize the victims. I want to give them a voice. Show the town that respected families were destroyed by this conspiracy. Morrison will arrest anyone who speaks up. Not if there are too many to arrest. Not if the whole community sees what really happened. Doc Hayes pulled out her medical files. I've been treating displaced families for months, living in terrible conditions. Malnourished children, women working themselves to death cleaning houses for pennies. Can you contact them quietly? Some of them, the ones who still trust me. Grace opened her medical bag and pulled out paper and ink. We'll write down their stories, create testimony that can't be ignored. What about the ledger? Hidden safe. We'll retrieve it when we need it. Doc Hayes lit a lamp and set it on the table. This is dangerous, Grace. If Morrison catches us organizing resistance, he'll claim we're planning violence. We're planning justice. There's a difference. They worked through the night. Doc Hayes wrote letters to displaced families, asking them to meet secretly at an abandoned church outside town. Grace prepared testimony forms, documenting each family's story in legal language. By morning, they had contacted 15 families. All had lost property under suspicious circumstances. All had been too frightened to speak up before. The abandoned church sat on a hill overlooking the valley. Grace and Doc Hayes arrived at sunset to find 23 people waiting. Men, women, and children who had lost everything to Whitmore's schemes. Sarah Mitchell spoke first. Her family's ranch was foreclosed after tax assessments suddenly tripled. Her husband was beaten unconscious when he questioned the valuation. Tom Bradford lost his farm when boundary markers mysteriously moved overnight. His property line shifted 2 miles, putting his house on someone else's land. Mary Rodriguez watched her husband die in a suspicious riding accident 3 days after he discovered forged signatures on their mortgage papers. One by one, the stories poured out. Years of systematic theft and intimidation. Families destroyed by calculated cruelty. Children left homeless while their land was sold to Whitmore's shell companies. Grace documented everything. Names, dates, specific details about forged documents and fraudulent proceedings. The testimonies painted a clear picture of organized crime reaching the highest levels of county government. We have enough evidence to hang Whitmore and Morrison both, Doc Hayes said. Evidence doesn't matter if no one hears it, Sarah Mitchell replied. They control the courts, the sheriff, the mayor. Then we go over their heads, Grace said. Federal authorities, territorial governor, someone who can't be bought. The group fell silent. Federal help seemed impossibly distant. Ezra sat in jail while they planned and talked. Morrison grew stronger every day they delayed. Grace stood up in the flickering candlelight. Tomorrow we take back our town. Grace and Doc Hayes arrived in town at dawn with 15 families following behind them. Word had spread through the displaced community overnight. More people joined them as they walked down Main Street. The group gathered in front of the courthouse where a wooden platform served for public announcements. Grace climbed the steps while Doc Hayes rang the courthouse bell to summon the town. People emerged from shops and houses. Curious faces peered from windows. Morrison appeared on the sheriff's office porch with his hand on his gun. People of Copper Ridge, Grace called out. I'm Grace Washington. Sheriff Morrison calls me a murderer, but I'm here to tell you the truth. Morrison pushed through the crowd toward the platform. "Arrest that woman. She's a federal fugitive." "Let her speak." Sarah Mitchell stepped forward with her 3 children. "We have a right to hear what she has to say." More displaced families surrounded the platform. Tom Bradford held up a bundle of legal papers. Mary Rodriguez carried a photograph of her dead husband. The evidence of their suffering was written on their faces. Grace opened the ledger and held it high. "This book contains records of every illegal land seizure in this county. Names, dates, forged signatures. Proof that your trusted leaders are thieves." Judge Whitmore emerged from the courthouse behind her. His usual composed demeanor had cracked. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "These are lies spread by criminals and malcontents," Whitmore announced. "This woman is wanted for murder. Sheriff Morrison, do your duty." Morrison drew his gun and stepped toward the platform. The displaced families moved closer together, forming a protective barrier around Grace. "Shoot one of us. You'll have to shoot us all," Tom Bradford said. Doc Hayes climbed onto the platform beside Grace. "I have medical records documenting systematic violence against these families. Beatings, intimidation, suspicious deaths." She opened her files and began reading names and injuries. The crowd grew silent as the list continued. Respected community members realized their neighbors had been suffering in silence for months. "These people were driven from their homes by fraud and violence," Doc Hayes continued. "Their children are malnourished. Their elderly are dying from exposure. All so Judge Whitmore could steal their land." Whitmore's face turned purple with rage. "Lies! Slander! Sheriff Morrison, clear this rabble from the courthouse!" Morrison raised his gun toward Grace. "Last warning. Surrender now or I'll shoot you for resisting arrest." "On whose authority?" A new voice called from the back of the crowd. Federal Marshal James Cooper pushed through the gathered people. His badge gleamed in the morning sunlight. Behind him came 2 more marshals and a territorial prosecutor. Grace's heart leaped. Doc Hayes had sent word to federal authorities days ago, but they hadn't expected help to arrive so quickly. "Marshal Cooper, Territorial Service," the lawman announced. "We're here investigating reports of systematic corruption in local government." Morrison's gun hand wavered. "These people are fugitives from federal justice." "According to whose reports?" Marshal Cooper examined a document from his coat pocket. "No federal warrants have been issued for Grace Washington, but we do have warrants for Judge Augustus Whitmore and Sheriff Caleb Morrison." The crowd gasped. Whitmore backed toward the courthouse door, but the second marshal blocked his path. "Charges include conspiracy, fraud, violation of federal homestead laws, and accessory to murder," Cooper continued. "We've been building this case for 3 months." Grace stared at the marshal in amazement. 3 months? Territorial governor received complaints from multiple counties. Your husband's letters reached the Capitol before he was killed, Mrs. Washington. His documentation started our investigation. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Her husband's sacrifice hadn't been in vain. His careful records had reached the right people. "You're under arrest," Cooper told Morrison. "Drop your weapon." Morrison's eyes darted around the crowd. He was surrounded by angry townspeople and federal marshals. His corruption had been exposed. His power was broken. The sheriff's gun clattered to the wooden platform. Marshal Cooper's assistant cuffed him while the prosecutor read the charges. "Judge Whitmore," Cooper called. "Step forward." Whitmore tried to maintain his dignity as they bound his hands. "This is a misunderstanding. I'm a respected member of this community." "You're a criminal who used your position to steal from honest families," Grace said from the platform. "Your respect was built on lies." The territorial prosecutor examined the ledger Grace had brought. Page after page of forged documents and fraudulent transactions. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. "This documentation is excellent," the prosecutor told Grace. "Combined with federal records, we have enough evidence to convict both men and reverse every illegal land seizure." The displaced families began to understand what this meant. Their stolen farms would be returned. Their suffering had been acknowledged. Justice was finally within reach. Tom Bradford climbed onto the platform. What about compensation for our losses? Crops we couldn't plant, livestock we had to sell. Federal law provides for full restitution in cases of official corruption, the prosecutor replied. Every family will be compensated from seized assets. Sarah Mitchell raised her hand. What about Ezra Holloway? Morrison arrested him yesterday. Marshal Cooper nodded to his assistant. Release all prisoners held on Morrison's authority. Charges are dropped. Grace watched through the courthouse window as Ezra emerged from the jail cell. He was bruised and exhausted, but alive. Their eyes met across the crowd, and he smiled. Doc Hayes addressed the gathered townspeople. These families need immediate assistance: food, shelter, medical care. They're our neighbors, and we failed to protect them. The crowd's mood had shifted from confusion to shame to determination. People stepped forward offering help. The baker promised free bread. The general store owner offered credit for supplies. Grace descended from the platform as federal marshals led Morrison and Whitmore away in chains. The corrupt officials who had terrorized the county for years were finally facing justice. Ezra reached her side and took her hand. You did it. You exposed them. We did it. All of us together. The ledger that had cost her husband's life would now restore dozens of families to their rightful homes. The truth had proven stronger than corruption. Doc Hayes joined them as the crowd began to disperse. What will you do now? Grace looked around the town square where justice had finally been served. These people needed leadership they could trust. Someone who understood their struggles and would fight for their rights. Stay, she said simply. This community needs healing. I think I can help with that. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in Territorial City delivered its verdict. Judge Augustus Whitmore received 15 years in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. Sheriff Caleb Morrison got 12 years for his role in the land theft scheme. The news reached Copper Ridge by telegraph on a crisp autumn morning. Grace Washington read the message aloud from the courthouse steps to a gathered crowd of townspeople. Cheers erupted when she finished. Justice has been served, Grace announced. Every stolen property will be returned to its rightful owners within 30 days. Tom Bradford wept openly as he clutched the deed to his family farm. Sarah Mitchell hugged her children, knowing they would finally have a real home again. Mary Rodriguez placed flowers on her husband's grave, whispering that his sacrifice had meaning. The territorial prosecutor had kept his promise about restitution. Whitmore's seized assets funded a compensation program for affected families. Bank accounts, property holdings, and investment portfolios were liquidated to pay damages. Grace had been appointed temporary county administrator by the territorial governor. Her first official act was establishing a public land records office with complete transparency. Every transaction would be documented and available for citizen review. Ezra rebuilt his cabin with help from neighbors whose land had been restored. The new structure was larger than before, with proper windows and a stone foundation. He installed surveying equipment in a dedicated office where he provided free property boundary services to local farmers. The community had elected Doc Eleanor Hayes as their new mayor. Her first ordinance required all law enforcement officers to undergo federal background checks. Corruption would never again take root so easily in Copper Ridge. Grace and Ezra's relationship had deepened through the months of legal proceedings and community rebuilding. Their shared struggle against injustice had forged a bond stronger than mere attraction. They understood each other's grief and found healing together. On a Saturday evening in late October, Ezra proposed marriage beside the well where Grace had hidden her husband's ledger. The same spot where their fight for justice had begun. She accepted without hesitation. The wedding took place on Ezra's restored ranch with the entire community in attendance. Tom Bradford served as best man. Doc Hayes performed the ceremony under her authority as mayor. Even the new federal marshal attended to show official support. Grace wore a simple blue dress that Doc Hayes had helped her sew. Ezra put on his only good suit, cleaned and pressed for the occasion. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to protect their community and each other. The celebration continued long into the night. Musicians played fiddle tunes while families danced on wooden platforms built for the occasion. Children ran between the tables, their laughter carrying across the valley. Sarah Mitchell presented Grace and Ezra with a wedding quilt sewn by all the women whose families had been restored. Each square told part of their shared story: the loss, the struggle, the eventual triumph of truth over corruption. "This community raised itself from ashes," Sarah said during her toast. "Grace and Ezra showed us how to fight for what's right." Grace stood to address the gathered crowd. These people had become her family through adversity. They had supported her when speaking truth meant risking everything. "My husband died believing that justice was possible," she said. "You all proved him right. Evil can only survive in darkness. When we bring truth into the light, it becomes powerless." The territorial governor had offered Grace a position in the capital, overseeing anti-corruption efforts across multiple counties. She declined, choosing instead to stay in Copper Ridge where her work had begun. Ezra resumed his surveying business, but with a broader mission. He traveled to neighboring towns, teaching property owners how to protect themselves from fraudulent schemes. His expertise helped prevent similar corruption from taking root elsewhere. Together, they established a legal aid society that provided free assistance to farming families dealing with property disputes. Grace's experience with legal documents and Ezra's surveying knowledge created a powerful combination for protecting land rights. The old ledger that had cost Grace's first husband his life now resided in a place of honor in the county records office. Visitors could examine the evidence that had exposed the conspiracy. It served as a reminder that ordinary citizens could challenge corruption when they worked together. Doc Hayes continued practicing medicine while serving as mayor. Her dual role allowed her to monitor both the physical and civic health of the community. She established protocols to identify and document suspicious injuries that might indicate intimidation or violence. A year after the wedding, Grace and Ezra welcomed their first child. The baby girl was born in the same cabin where Grace had first found refuge. They named her Hope, representing their faith in the community's future. The ranch became a gathering place for families throughout the valley. Sunday dinners brought together people from all backgrounds to share food and stories. The isolation that had once defined Ezra's life was replaced by constant companionship. Grace opened a school in the town's new community center. She taught reading, writing, and basic legal knowledge to ensure future generations could protect themselves from exploitation. Education became the foundation of lasting reform. On summer evenings, Grace and Ezra sat on their porch watching their daughter play in the yard. The same dog that had led Ezra to Grace now protected their child. Rusty's son carried on his father's legacy of loyalty and service. The distant mountains that had once seemed like barriers now felt like guardians watching over their peaceful valley. Grace's journey from fugitive to community leader proved that courage and truth could overcome any adversary. Copper Ridge had become more than a place to live. It was proof that democracy worked when citizens demanded accountability from their leaders. The community that corruption had nearly destroyed was now stronger and more just than ever before. Grace Washington and Ezra Holloway had found love in the midst of struggle, but more importantly, they had found their purpose in serving others and protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit them.